the G20 Information Series. We're delighted to have you here with us. We'll give it a couple of moments for colleagues to join us. In the meantime, it would be great if you can introduce yourself in the chat, your name, your organization, which part of the world you're calling from, just so others can get a sense of who's in this virtual room with us today. And one of the pointers we took away from our last call is people are really looking to make connections and find out who else is working in this space. So this would be a great opportunity to do that. If you are able to, we encourage you to keep your videos on. It's always nice to see faces and reactions, but we also understand that this might not be possible, so we appreciate that too. Thanks, Leonora, for kicking that off for us.
Did I come in?
Hi, everyone. As you're joining us, we're just giving it a couple of moments more for colleagues to join us. As you join, please do introduce yourself in the chat and your organization and where in the world you're calling from today. I'd also like to share that Natalie Ross from Council on Foundations, who was going to be moderating the discussion today and is partnering with us on leading the Wings US Members Task Force, unfortunately fell sick and won't be able to make it today. But we are pivoting and we'll have Rion, my colleague, who'll be moderating the discussion today. Great. I think we can get started as we have people joining us. So thank you, everyone, for joining the second session of the G20 Information Series. My name is Samira Mhera, and I am the Collective Intelligence and Advocacy Director at Wings. For those of you who may not know, Wings is the global network of philanthropy support and development organizations. We bring together over 230 or now 250 organizations in 60 countries. And a chunk of our membership is networks of networks who bring in a diversity of philanthropy stakeholders, helping extend our reach to over close to 100,000 organizations. In the previous session, we focused on understanding the G20, the architecture, its moving parts, and we heard directly from different kinds of philanthropic actors about how they've engaged in the G20 process, what it takes, how it adds value to their work, what's possible, and what are some of the barriers. In case you missed it, we're happy to share the notes and the recording. The second part is really about moving from the first step of understanding. The real question, and one that we want to focus on, is how does philanthropy actually engage in a space like the G20 in a way that is strategic, that is coordinated, it's connected, it's impactful and collective? Because that has power. The reality is that in our experience, and as I've been learning about the G20 process since Brazil, is that it's not a single moment in time. It's really a very dynamic ecosystem made up of multiple engagement groups, both formal and informal, networks, processes, each with its own logic, timelines, and influence pathways. And the G20, when it's being hosted in a country, provides an opportunity for all different stakeholders to coalesce and see what is possible, to put certain agendas on the table that might not have seen the light of day, to advocate and to push things forward, and really to move from recommendations or ideas to action. So this session is really looking to build on that learning. Through our engagement, we've learned that there are a number of different non-state actors, engagement groups who operate in this space: business, think tanks, labor, faith organization, impact coalitions, social enterprises. Because of the reasons that we've identified, this space offers both insight and opportunity. And we've had the privilege to be collaborating and learning about them in many different shapes and forms. And one of the things that we've been inspired by is how these groups are organizing, mobilizing, and positioning themselves collectively to shape agendas that influence outcomes. So we want this session to focus on three things. One is we're really looking for inspiration and activation, hearing how these groups have organized themselves to engage in the G20, what was the value, what worked, what didn't, and what can we as philanthropy and as a sector take from that, both as individual organizations, as networks, and also as a sector. Second, clarity, understanding how these different spaces do what they do, how they operate to a certain extent, and what could be the real entry points for philanthropy to engage, given that we bring a diversity of strengths. And third, this is a time and a moment for unusual allyship. So, how can these alliances, these joint convenings, these joint messages really find their way into this process? And what is the pathway for that? At Wings, our role is really to strengthen the collective voice and the collective action of philanthropy as a sector in all its diversity. And how do we come together to navigate this complexity, build collective approaches, and move from interest and ideas to action? And it's particularly important now as we move from Brazil to South Africa to the US, soon to the UK. And across these G20 presidencies, how do we maintain continuity and influence while agendas are still being shaped? Entry points are emerging, and there is a real opportunity to ensure that philanthropy is engaging actively. So, with that, I am pleased to introduce this panel that's going to be moderated by Rion, and he will do some deep dive introductions. We have Monica Pasqualen, who joins us from Brazil, from G20 for Impact, and where Wings and G20 for Impact work very closely together on the C20 Philanthropy Working Group, which was the first of its kind to make sure that we were aligning our recommendations and that there was coherency and wherever possible partnering to make collective asks. We're joined by Cas Kuvadir, B20 South Africa Sherpa, who along with Anthony Costa was instrumental in opening the door for philanthropy within the business agenda. A short meeting, a strong alignment on values and goals led to some very powerful convenings and ultimately the launch of the first ever Business Philanthropy Legacy Initiative. Richard Ponzio from the Stimson Center, who's part of the coalition co-leading the T20 in the US and already creating entry points for philanthropy, including the ongoing consultation processes right now, which run till April 6th. Katherine Marshall from Interfaith 20, who brings a long-standing perspective on values-driven engagement in the G20. And this is also a space where Wings members like Richard Marker are helping build bridges between philanthropy and faith-based actors. And Mark Mittelhauser, part of the L20 or Labor 20 US leadership, representing the labor voice, one that showed up really strongly during the South African presidency in the social summit, for instance, and at a time when US engagement was limited, reinforcing the importance of these multilateral spaces and global solidarity. So across this panel, you'll really be hearing from actors who are actively engaging and shaping pathways for how we could be collectively influencing the agenda and moving things forward. And on that note, I'm going to pass it over to Rion.
Thank you, Samira, and thank you, colleagues, for joining us here today. As Samira has mentioned, my name is Rion. I am based in South Africa, and I'm the G20 coordinator working with Wings. I've been working with Wings since the Brazil presidency, and so it's been a very interesting journey to learn about the ecosystem, to engage with many of the peers here. And as Samira mentioned, to realize that there's many more entry points for influence than you would think from the outside. So I'm very excited about the panel that we're having today. Just to give a little bit of context about the composition of the panel, Samira has already done a bit of an introduction about the individual members that will be speaking to us today. But you also notice that in the panel design, we were looking at how do we look backwards and learn from the past, from both the Brazil and South African presidencies, and then also look forward to what's going to happen this year with the eye of building bridges towards the UK and South Korea. And so when we're looking back, we have two very strong sectors represented here, the business community and the civil society community, which there has been a lot of philanthropic engagement already, as Samira highlighted, from Brazil and South Africa. Looking forward into the US, we have three very strong social sector stakeholder groups that are represented here that are diverging, but at the same time focus on many similar issues. We have the faith community, we have the labor community, and we have the think tank community. And so a lot of the discussion today is going to focus on unpacking how do these different sectors engage with the G20 and what are some of the entry points for the philanthropic sector. So without anything else, I'm going to jump right into it. And I'm going to head over to you, Cass, from the business community and the B20 process in South Africa. And I'd really love to get your reflections on what was the significance of the G20 in South Africa for the business community, and how has that legacy from the South African presidency really carried over beyond it?
Thank you, and thanks for having me, and thanks for the opportunity to participating. And hello to all the colleagues and to those joining in. So, this was the first time we hosted the B20 essentially, and there were a couple of critical points for us. So the first one was that this was going to be an African B20, not just a South African B20. And I think what we succeed doing, and that's beginning to sort of pay off now, and I'll come to that just now, what we succeeded is doing is bringing together probably the largest grouping of African CEOs into an event, and not just into an event, but to engage on through the various task forces critical issues for the continent and play a critical role in arriving at the recommendations that were made to the G20. I think the second issue is that we hosted this B20 at a time when the geopolitics are extremely complex and extremely challenging. And the one word that sort of resonated through the B20 last year was the word reset. And that was the sort of theme that went through. Our theme was essentially in building inclusive societies and prosperity through global cooperation. But given the geopolitics, I think in a lot of the discussion throughout the year, including the task forces, everybody agreed that while the geopolitics present challenges and problems, it also presents opportunities for a reset and opportunities for different alliances and different mechanisms to develop trade and investment relationships that have not been there before. So it's those things that drove us, and we put Africa at the center, and we arrived at recommendations, 30 recommendations, all in all, that talked to the African situation as well as the global situation, because we positioned Africa's challenges and Africa's opportunities as not just challenges and opportunities for the continent, but challenges and opportunities for the world. Because Africa has a number of opportunities that if we actually succeed in promoting those opportunities and actually implementing from those opportunities, we address a number of problems that the globe actually has. So if you take arable land, Africa has among the biggest amounts of arable land in the world. If we manage agriculture properly, if we manage food security properly, we're also contributing to the food insecurity problem in the world. Africa has the critical minerals that are needed for digital economies, for AI and so on, and we can leverage off that. Africa has the natural resources for renewable and clean energy, sun, wind, water, and others. And the demographics of Africa at a time when many parts of the world's working age population is decreasing because of aging. Africa has young people that, if appropriately trained and skilled, can actually fill those gaps. And so we positioned Africa as a contributor, critical contributor to addressing some of the challenges that the world has. And I think we succeeded in doing that. So, and just to finish off, I mean, when we started, I could count on one hand the CEOs in South Africa who understood what the B20 was. As we started and as we progressed, and we met, and I'll come to that just now, we met in the next question, we met with about 15 to 20 CEOs about 2 weeks ago from across the continent. And what the B20 has done, it's created a momentum that CEOs definitely want to maintain and definitely want to take G20 South Africa and really make it G20 Africa this year, or B20 Africa this year. And so those were some of the critical points that came up for us. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Cass, and also thank you for highlighting that transition from it being a national agenda to it being a regional agenda, and how you managed to get the entire sector on board, even though they didn't necessarily know what the G20 was. Jumping then to Monica, as Samir had mentioned, Monica, you were very involved in the C20 engagement process from Philanthropy side, and helping to bring that process together. It would be great to get a sense from you on how did you organize the sector, and how did you help the sector to organize itself to influence the G20, and what worked and what didn't, based on your experience.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me, and so I can bring some of the learnings that we had during G20 in Brazil. So I represent Dynamo Lab, which is a not-for-profit organization that fosters and advocates for a more impactful economy towards an inclusive, equitable, and regenerative economy here in Brazil and worldwide. And G20 for Impact was an initiative that brought together 50 plus global organizations to bring recommendations for the G20 arena, since G20 is the wider economic forum that combines at least 80% of the international trade, 75% of the world GDP, and also, I don't recall, but 70% of the green gas emissions. So it's a very important forum for us to influence too. And what we decided to do is to hack the system, basically, because we were very close to the government here in Brazil, and we had at least 2 channels to hack the system there. And we were very close also to the Sustainable Finance Working Group and C20. And we worked a lot with WINS and also a group here in Brazil called GIFI. And in this endeavor of bringing philanthropy to the basis of economic and impactful new economy. So the learnings that we had is that G20 as a horizontal forum has lack of a structured governance. So the continuity of these initiative is very, very hard, even though we do have an ongoing process in the Sherpa tracks and the finance track as well, and in the engagement groups. The host country, second learning that we had the host country and key stakeholders are learning as they're going. So it's very difficult and challenging for local stakeholders to understand how this structure will develop within the host country. And I understand that in the United States, in this geopolitical situation, is going to be harder. So one of the learnings that we had is to focus on less priorities and be together on those priorities, and try to make it more, not wider, but a way that can bring multiple stakeholders into those priorities. And it's quite challenging because different players have different agendas, and this could jeopardize the recommendations and of the proposals. So I believe one message that I could bring to you is to try to convene more and try to have those priorities very interconnected as an economy must be. And philanthropy is is essential to this new economic development.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Monica. And also sharing with us how you managed the importance of convenings, that you pointed out, which is a very important part of what we're doing here. Even just coming together and speaking about the G20 already is an outcome, and the relationship building and network building that comes from that. I'd like to shift our attention now towards our looking forward part of the panel. And one thing I will highlight also about the three groupings that are represented here, think tanks, faith community, and the labor community, is that they have cross-cutting networks that have existed year on year. Many of them have run for multiple years, and they're building on the momentum from previous years. However, we also know that the US situation is very different from the context in Brazil, from the context in South Africa. As we heard from both Monica and Cass, each country has to adapt to its own unique circumstances. And so within that context, I'd like to head over to Katherine. Katherine, as part of the Interfaith 20, I remember hearing about the Interfaith 20 that was held in Cape Town, which is also very, very successful. If you could share a little bit about why do you think it's important for faith communities to engage in a process like the G20, and what have some of the outcomes from that engagement been?
Great. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and delighted to be here. The core argument for the quote faith voice is that religious communities involve perhaps 80 to 90% of the world's population that has some kind of religious affiliation. And yet, for a lot of historic reasons, having their voice part of the global governance processes has been complex and challenging. But the G20 Interfaith Forum now has been fundamentally focused on the G20 since 2014. And we were especially active in both Brazil and in South Africa. And we very much welcome what I'm delighted my colleague Anne Simmons-Benton from the W20 calls radical collaboration. The idea that we really are trying to find the common ground as we look at this very special, rather complex, shall we say, instrument of global governance, which is the G20. So looking at the G20 interfaith, clearly our objective is to bring both the ideas, some of which are ethical, some of which are deeper, but also the experience of the world's faith communities into the G20 through work with what we call a network of networks. You use the same phrase, but it's very core to what we do. In other words, there are, I count, 30 to 40 different communities that include the big interfaith organizations, but ACT Alliance, health organizations, peace organizations, et cetera, bringing their experience into the G20 process. We've worked a lot with, for example, the T20 in a number of years, and a number of other of the communities were very focused on both women and youth. And in some ways, of course, religious communities are part of the civil society, but in other ways, they don't fit very comfortably with it. I have experience. I was with the World Bank when Jim Wolfenson, the president, drafted me to work on his outreach to religious communities, and still have scars from the tensions that created. So I think we're acutely aware of the complexities, but also of the power. To focus on last year, South Africa, but also looking to the US and to the UK, where we're already quite actively involved in thinking through what might be the focus and how we might engage. We see the religious communities as really dealing with pretty much any issue across the full G20 agenda, but having a particular focus on the world's most vulnerable communities, which is a very strong common theme across the different religious communities worldwide. That has meant in both Brazil and South Africa a very strong focus on hunger and food. And that has been important. We've also, for a number of years, had a very active involvement with the African Union, and thus the too often neglected voice of Africa. Another area that we focus on quite a lot and consistently over the years is the problem of pluralism in plural societies and the tensions, the deep divides in communities across the world, and the ways in which the religious communities, through education, through leadership, can try to bridge some of these divides and find common ground, trying to find a common purpose. That's important. A third issue that I would mention that again, it's not on the formal agenda, but it's very much on the back agenda, shall we say, comes really from the very substantial focus of the G20, but also of the G20 interfaith on issues of health and the roles that different communities play in, for example, pandemic preparedness, but also even in neglected diseases, et cetera. And so we do see keeping that focus, despite the ups and downs, central is important. Just one last issue. The last year, but I'm afraid inadvertently, deliberately or not, the issues of sustainable debt are very much at the core of the G20 agendas. And they clearly have a very strong link to the religious communities when you go back to the Jubilee year 2000, but last year, 2025, was a Jubilee year. A lot of effort went into making both the practical but also some of the ethical cases for action on debt through the common framework, but well beyond. And there I see in all of these areas that I've highlighted room for radical collaboration across the different engagement groups in trying to reshape the global agenda as well as to work within the G20 agenda as we look forward.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Katherine. Also, thank you for sharing a little bit about how that community, the faith communities, have been coming into this process. I'd like to then shift over to you, Mark. Obviously, the L20, Labour 20 represents a very important constituency as well, the Labour community, the worker community. And in South Africa, that was extremely robust, given our very strong tradition of trade unions and workers' rights movements. Maybe if you could just give us a little bit of an idea of what is the L20 agenda for this presidency, specifically in the US, and why do you believe these issues need to be put forward at this specific time?
Thanks, Rian, and hi to everybody from Washington. It's great to be on this panel with fellow engagement groups. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the L20, we represent the voice of workers around the world, and it's anchored by the International Trade Union Confederation, which represents about 190 million workers. And this year, the national lead is the AFL-CIO, which is the largest trade union federation in the US. So our approach this year has been driven by a really challenging US G20 presidency, as you noted, Rian. I think the other speakers have too. And from our perspective, the so-called back to basics approach of the US has really foreclosed nearly every entry point that engagement groups like the G20 have had. The US presidency has reduced the number of official tracks from 23 under the South African presidency to about 3 or 4 this year, and the recognized engagement groups from 13 to about 2 or 3. So as a result of this, most of the priority issues of engagement groups, and I would also say probably of philanthropy, are just simply not being discussed, and they're being left off of the agenda. So in this unusual year, the L20 has adapted to adopt a new approach. And I think in most years, the L20 would be developing statements, engaging within the G20 process to discuss priority issues related to the official agenda. This year, instead, we've had to focus more on communicating externally to highlight the vital priorities that are being left behind in the G20. The L20 did release a statement a couple of weeks ago on the G20, but since there was no sort of formal way to transmit those statements, we're instead using the communications teams of the ITUC, of some of the national affiliates, and of other allied organizations. In terms of the issues we're looking at, the statement focused on traditional issues like creating good jobs, fair wages and taxation, maintaining worker protections in the face of deregulation, and promoting just transitions with respect to climate change, but also with respect to the digital economy. The other priority that we've adopted this year has been to strengthen partnerships in the face of what we see as efforts to weaken the voice of civil society in the G20. And so we're coordinating with other engagement groups, including the W20. It's good to see Anne on the call, Y20, B20, IF20, T20, and C20. And also trying to expand our network by holding regular meetings with allied think tanks and advocacy organizations. And then we're also trying to engage more with like-minded governments, international organizations, and of course, philanthropy to sustain dialogue on some of these really crucial priorities. And I've been working on the G20 for about 15 years from the government side. So, I mean, my experience has been that for progress to actually be maintained in the G20, you need to sustain a focus over a number of cycles of the G20. And so a presidency like this one, where key issues are being left off the table, really raises concerns about halting the progress that was made in the South African and in the Brazilian G20s. So our main focus this year has really been to try to build a bridge between some of the progress of those presidencies and to the presidencies of the UK and South Korea. In this regard, some of the issues that we picked are issues that were key areas of focus of those presidencies prior, including addressing inequalities in the global economy and lifting incomes of workers. And we had a major event last month on inequalities. We're going to host another one next month on increasing the labor income share in our economies on the margins of the G20 finance track meeting. Another issue we're looking at is gender equity. It really remains a core issue for us, especially after South Africa last year adopted new targets on closing the gender pay gap, but also on bringing more women into the labor force. So we're working with the W20 on that. And then we also hope to host an event on the dangers of rising heat stress for workers linked to climate change during the year. I would finally say there are two issues on the official agenda where we believe that some progress can be made. One of them is in the trade track, and it's a focus on import bans related to goods made with forced labor. And so we're going to partner with Harvard in coming months to host an event on forced labor and supply chains around the world. And then the other issue is workforce development and training related to AI and technology. And we're having some discussions about working with the B20 on that issue. But there are some good models between collaboration between labor and business in the US that I think also could be highlighted there. So thanks for the question. And those are some of the key issues that we're looking at and trying to figure out how to adapt to this challenging year.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Mark. I think one thing that's standing out from a lot of the comments that's being made is the importance of different engagement groups working with each other. And I think what's really emerging is that it is a dense network of non-state actors from different sectors collaborating. And I'd also like to appreciate everyone who's kept their remarks very brief so far. That's really very much appreciated from a time management perspective, so we can get to everyone. Then I'm going to move to our last but not least panelist, which is Richard from the T20. Now, Richard, I know that the T20 is also a very robust international network that's been running for several years. As Mark mentioned, the success is multiple cycles, and I think the T20 has exhibited that. And even in South Africa, I know there was a lot of success made, but what we'd really also like to focus on is how is the G20 evolving to meet the US moment? And also, what are the plans for it to evolve through the US moment and beyond? So over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Rian and Samira. Good day, everyone. Let me use my 5 minutes to answer Rian's questions. I'll be saying a few words initially about the G20, some of its major milestones, of course, through the lens of a policy researcher or an analyst. What we're observing at the start of the G20 US that began in December, as you all know, and some concluding thoughts on the variety of ways foundations have intersected both with the T20 and the other engagement groups mentioned on this call. Since the United States helped to elevate the Group of 20 to a heads of state forum at the November 2008 G20 Washington Summit in response to the 2008-9 financial crisis, this gathering of the most influential states, Monica referred to some of the key stats that you've all heard before, G20 has really contributed, and this is a really important point, alongside formal multilateral governance, both at the global and regional levels, to novel and agile approaches to global and regional decision-making and collective action. More specifically, the G20 has proven itself in bringing together some of the most influential states alongside non-state partners in, for instance, responding to the 2008 financial crisis, getting across the finish line in the last stage of the Paris Climate Agreement negotiations back in 2015. And then I think we can all admit that the rollout of the vaccines from Western countries in particular was quite slow, arguably very slow. But at the same time, the G20 chalked up another major win that earlier this decade by garnering political momentum, public-private networks, and other capabilities for socioeconomic recovery from the recent COVID-19 pandemic. We might all recall the timely debt service suspension initiative of the G20 for low-income countries at the time in 2020, 2021, but that was followed soon by the Common Framework for Debt Treatment. During this past mid-December's first gathering here in Washington of Sherpas for the G20 US, the pressure on the US and influence of the other 18 member states, EU and AU, successfully resulted in a new fourth working group to achieve a new consensus on trade. This is alongside the other working groups, which I imagine was mentioned in earlier briefings, but let me just state regulatory reform, energy supply chains, not the just green transition type, I must say, and technological innovation, including AI, of course. We're also learning that in the initial progress underway these last few weeks, U.S. diplomats have allowed the originally narrow subject matter of individual working groups to be broadened in response to other countries' proposals. At this time, for our T20 US initiative, which is co-led by, besides Stimson, Brookings, Quincy Institute, other interested US think tanks, we purposely introduced in the title of our project for this year, Alternative before the T20 US, in response to the decision of the US administration to only formally recognize the B20 engagement group. And this despite the formal recognition of the think tank 20 since it first was convened in support of the G20 Mexico in 2012. And I understand this to be the case for several of the other longstanding G20 engagement groups. So in short, and now in its 15th year, the T20 has brought together some of the world's sharpest thought leaders and policy research institutes to provide all G20 members with a global research capacity to drive evidence-based policymaking. And we very much hope to build on and ensure continuity from these recent G20s. We've been hearing about Brazil today, South Africa, and many others that have focused and put squarely on the G20's agenda issues such as development, inequality, climate action, and peace. And finally, let me conclude with some thoughts on the ways foundations have been and may wish to continue to be represented in this overall space. In partnership with the T20, for instance, we very much welcome your further participation in shaping the Global Policy Network's dynamic research agenda, as well as supporting senior policymaker outreach through active participation in our series of Track 1.5 policy dialogues throughout the year. We'll have activities coming up during the spring meetings of the Bank Fund. Our midterm conference will be part of the Global Solutions Summit annual June 1st, June 2nd Global Solutions Summit of the GSI. Some of you know. Bangkok, of course, is when the annual meetings of the World Bank and IMF this year We hope to have the culmination of some of our work streams focus. But in New York, we'll be there twice this year, both during UNGA High Level Week, of course, but our T20 Summit is we're looking towards dates in the middle of November, a few weeks out from the G20 Summit in Miami. Two final quick points. Our core activities also create the space for active promotion, for example, for the F20s and broader philanthropic community's recommendations to the G20. And we're set up as scholars to do policy research and showcasing the capabilities of the philanthropic community as an important sector in global governance. Finally, foundations are well positioned, as this discussion shows, to encourage a strength in numbers approach vis-a-vis governments and through joint advocacy webinars and in-person programming by the T20 alongside this formally designated B20. But there's also, of course, more than a dozen other traditional engagement groups such as those here today. Let me stop here, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that robust insight. I think what I really appreciate as well is highlighting the way that foundations and philanthropies can become involved in the work of the different engagement groups. As a sector, Wings and its partners have been thinking through exactly that question, and I think this is the perfect space for us to have insights on that. So then building on that insight into how philanthropies and foundations can get involved, I think we'll do another round of questions, but if we can also keep them brief, because time, as with these conversations is usually the case, is not on our side. So if we could do maybe 2-minute reflections, I'll also just raise my hand just to give you an indication of when we reach that mark. And then, sorry, Cass, I'm going to go to you right now. I see that you're unmuted. I just quickly want to also highlight to everyone that if you do have questions, please do put them in the chat. We're not going to have a Q&A for this, but we are going to be copying all the questions and we'll be gathering insights to do a Q&A document that will be shared afterwards. So all your questions will be answered and we will share insights. Going actually to you then, Cass, maybe as we're ending off the session, if you could maybe also just reflect on what do you see are the opportunities for business philanthropy collaboration going forward, building on the G20 in South Africa, but also in current and future G20s.
Thanks. So very quickly, I think as Samira said in the beginning, I think we laid a good basis for business philanthropy cooperation during the South African G20. And what I sort of avert to earlier is that we've been interacting with a number of CEOs on the continent, and we had a meeting with about 15 to 20 CEOs about 2 weeks ago, and there's a lot of interest, and we're working on a work plan for this to actually keep the momentum that B20 in South Africa created, keep it going on the continent, and identify 3 or 4 critical themes that came out of the recommendations of the B20 and establish a business-led initiative to get some implementation and action going on those themes. Also to enable a business-led forum, a CEO-led forum, to interact with the AU on policy matters, to interact and be the voice of the continent on other global forums, including the B20. And included in that initiative is to see, particularly in the infrastructure funding area, capital mobilization area, which is one of the areas that we're looking at as one of the themes. We want to continue the discussion we had in South Africa on business philanthropy interaction and collaboration and take that on to the rest of the continent as well. And so we will have a business plan ready in the next 2 weeks to put to these 15 or 20 CEOs and hopefully spend the rest of this year concretizing some of the critical themes that came out of B20 South Africa and ensuring that putting Africa at the center during B20 South Africa is now concretized by Africa remaining on the table, on the global table, going forward. And we'll use the B20 and the recommendation that came out of the B20 as the sort of hook and hanger for that. And so that's the plan going forward, certainly this year and possibly certainly up to the hosting of the UK next year. We've also had discussions with the British business and talk to them about how they pick up some of the issues that will not be picked up in the US hosting, and we'll be working closely with them in the run up to their hosting as well. So that's what the plan is, and philanthropy will be an essential element of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cass, for those insights. Katherine, the same question to you. You've given us a lot of background as to what the Interfaith 20 does, what it is, what its agenda items are. Maybe just 2 minutes, quick remarks on where you think foundations and philanthropy can collaborate best and what are the best entry points.
I think at this moment of upheaval in international systems, perhaps no system has been as much affected as international development and humanitarian work, where capacity has basically been demolished and threatened. We need creative thinking about future directions. And there I see major areas for alliance between foundations, philanthropy, and the array of networks that are working on religious issues. And some of it will be very concrete. We've heard mention of forced labor, human trafficking, which is an issue that a lot of the religious communities on trying to deal with international financial systems, on issues for climate, obviously, gender, etc. There is unfortunately too long a list of areas where we need to collaborate in the realm of feasibility, but I see all kinds of potential for collaboration.
Thank you for that, Katherine. And just to also highlight to everyone that we will continue to share information about some of the events that come up here as we collaborate with the engagement groups. I'm going to then head over to Mark. Similar question. Where do you see in the extensive agenda that you highlighted, philanthropy and foundations, the best entry point for collaboration with your sector during the US G20 and beyond?
Thanks, Rian. And very quickly, I think this is a really important inflection point for the voice of civil society in the G20. So I think philanthropy's role is actually more important than ever. I'll be honest, for all the reasons that we've talked about, I don't see a lot of productive entry points during this presidency. But I think from a longer term perspective that there's really vital work to be done in building capacity for coming years. And I think actually the Wings report on this coming out of the South African presidency, I think provides a really helpful framework for this. And I would just say some of the areas from the labor perspective are sustaining the engagement groups themselves. One thing I've realized this year is that many of the engagement groups sort of have to reinvent themselves annually, and they're often scrambling for new funding just to hold a summit. So that basic infrastructure is important to support. I think they're also in terms of communicating and amplifying the messages, support to kind of the outreach and comms functions of these groups. And then, we've talked a lot about networks and partnerships, and it's certainly a big focus for us, but setting the table for that to happen. And, not only in terms of the organizations themselves, but sort of individual members and, explaining the arcane language of the G20 and why it's useful. In our case, to individual workers is really important. There's a need for greater monitoring and accountability across all of the tracks of the G20. And philanthropy has the ability to fund independent voices, independent research in a way that they can bring challenging issues to the table. So, I think especially as we look at what needs to be done to close the gender pay gap, there's a lot of opportunity there for engagement. And then more broadly, independent research and policy briefs on discussions that will emerge during the UK presidency. And then I would say finally, philanthropy can get a real seat at the table by supporting models of interventions that advance the policy priorities across a variety of the different areas. And, I think many organizations are probably already funding work in areas like, protecting workers and skills training and reducing inequalities and extending protections. And so joining that to your G20 engagement, I think will multiply the impact of it. I think the Ford Foundation is providing a good example, at least from an L20 perspective this year, of how that can work. And I'm sure there are other good examples out there that Wings has highlighted. But I would say just in closing that it's important to engage now to identify the opportunities, and then really to work with partners in the UK to figure out what the issues are going to be on the agenda. We're still looking to figure out exactly what those will be, but really building the capacity down the line and philanthropy's ability to sort of fund over various cycles is really a superpower.
Thank you for that, Mark, and also thank you for highlighting the importance of early engagement and how that allows you to shape the agenda and the process. I think one of the interventions like these are meant to do exactly that. Speaking of also lessons, I think turning then also to you, Monica, you have the vantage point of having been part of a process where engagement groups and philanthropy have collaborated, and you've seen how that plays out. What are some of the outcomes of that? So in your experience working at this intersection between philanthropy and its engagement in the G20, where do you think philanthropy could be engaging, and what are some of the lessons for that partnership that you think other colleagues here who go into the US and UK need to be aware of?
So I totally agree with Mark. I think philanthropy has an important role in funding those initiatives, but it can have a pivotal role beyond that too. So if we want to scale impact on very important issues that everybody mentioned here, gender equality, climate change, inequality, we do need philanthropy to engage with impact investing, in my opinion. And this was something that we understood. There's a momentum, even with, as we say, mainstream economy, to understand how we can build this transition into this new economy development. So from our perspective and learnings, philanthropy has this key role of de-risking some of the investments. And I know this is very controversial sometimes. It's like a balance of how to put philanthropy capital into key areas and sectors. But the most important learning that we had is that we can find some shared ground and understand how we can together bring that voice that is basically the same goal. And this is very important. The narrative and the message that we want to bring to those politicians and how we can influence them and as a whole is key. So, and I think this is the biggest challenge that the engagement groups have. And not only, but we tried to hack the system, as I mentioned, into the Sustainable Finance Working Group, which is in the finance track. And it's very, very hard to do that. But if we do it collectively and collaboratively, we may have a chance. So, and I understand that this G20 can be quite challenging, but as Mark mentioned and Katherine mentioned, and also Kaz mentioned, it's about creating momentum for the following years. So.
Thank you for that, Monica. And again, thank you so much for all the panelists, Katherine, Monica, Mark, Richard, Cass, for coming here and sharing your insights. This is the first of many conversations, hopefully, of what will turn out to be an interesting presidency, but also building on for future presidency of G20. With that, I'm also going to hand over to Samira to just close off the session for us. Before I do that, I also just want to highlight that the T20, I'm sure Richard will share about this in the chat as well, is actually having a donors roundtable later today. And we did share it in email with all of you to be able to register where you have to reach out to. And I think that's a great example of how we can start practically building those relationships between philanthropy and the engagement groups. Samira, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Rion, and thank you so much to all of our speakers. Your insights, your experiences, your guidance has been extremely, extremely valuable. I learn something new every time. And I think strategizing in a networked approach is critical in times like this to figure out how we can pivot, how we can still influence and still find a way forward. I'd also like to thank our partners, Anglo-American Foundation, Foundations 20, Council on Foundations, to have partnered on this two-part series with us. If I had to recap some of the key takeaways on for philanthropy, I think some of what we heard today reinforces our initial conversation. This is a moment in time to really mobilize the sector and come together. I think building on from Cass's insights around, they didn't really know what G20 was, but now there is continuity within the country, leveraging the momentum and actually translating the recommendations into action and moving that forward in the country, but also in the region and showcasing what that could mean for the global landscape. The point about radical collaboration, this is the time for unusual allyship. The moment calls for it. And as you can hear from stakeholders, there is openness and appetite to think together, at the very least, to strategize together and to look at how we can plant the seeds of continuity. And I think that's the third point. Continuity is key. Continuity for action in country, across regions, and across years. How do we pass on the baton? And I think the work that will be done and has been done in Brazil, South Africa, previous presidencies, even in the US, and the handover to the UK and beyond is going to really matter. And again, there are many, many different roles that philanthropy stakeholders can play. The convening power, the backing power, the ability to invest in stuff that others might not, to take risks that others can't, to bring in catalytic funding, to bring in local leadership, local decision makers, and be that connector is extremely valuable in a time like this. So let's leverage our unique strengths in terms of how you can be engaged. I think there's a question from Dan. The time to engage is now. If you are in the UK, the government is already mobilizing and is putting out asks for, key things that you want to put on the agenda. So find networks that you can be part of. Please ask us for more information. There are groups such as Bond who are already starting to mobilize and position themselves as leaders for the C20 in the UK. There are other developments that are taking place around the business community. We have a G20 US Philanthropy Task Force that is coming together on a regular basis to strategize and to look at what we could be dividing and actioning moving forward. We'll also be organizing some key convenings at key moments, such as the Council of Foundations Conference, Sidelines of Wings Forum, UNGA as touch points for collective engagement. If you'd like to learn more, we are developing briefings and notes, and we'd love to share this with you. I think the opportunity is there, despite the challenging situation. Actually, it makes it even more needed. Entry points are emerging, and it'll be great to collectively figure out how we can make the most of that. There is a conference that's coming up in the UK as another engagement point for those who may not be aware. Please do look it up. And I realize that we are at time. So thank you so much, everyone, for engaging and joining us today. And once again, thank you very much to our speakers. It's been really, really helpful to get your insights. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Yes.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a nice day, evening.
You too.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.